the Books Podcast, presented by Tim Hague.
Well, I'm sitting in the publishers of W.W. Norton with Nicholas Wapshott, who's an old friend of this site, and whose new book is The Sphinx. And we'd better do the subtitle as well. It's Franklin Roosevelt, the Isolationists, and the Road to World War II. And that's exactly what it's about. So let's start off with the title. The Sphinx is obviously Roosevelt, FDR. Who called him that? Why? And was it fair?
Well, taking them back to front, I suppose. Yes, it was fair.
Okay.
The Sphinx, of course, is that cryptic figure that no one ever quite knows why it's smiling or why it exists or whatever. So anyone who's called the Sphinx is a mystery. And what Franklin Roosevelt did was to keep on tenterhooks the whole of the Washington press about whether he was really going to stand for a third term, that is the election of 1940, November 1940, whether he would stand for a third term, which would be unprecedented, and which the founders of the Republic, George Washington and Jefferson chipped in, said that this was something no president should do. So Franklin Roosevelt felt he needed a third term because, as you can tell from
there was
the
a bit
timing,
of trouble going on.
1940, it was a key moment. He was anxious that if someone else took charge of the United States wouldn't enter World War II. They still hadn't entered World War II. It had been going on for a year. And so he was very cryptic about it. He went into the Gridiron Dinner, which is the dinner of Washington press corps. Every year in January they have it. They still have it to this day. And he went in, and there was a 6 foot long, 6 foot high, papier-mâché, golden painted model of the Sphinx with his smiling face on it and with his cigarette holder in it and with his pince-nez on. And he, of course, laughed his head off. He loved, well, first of all, he loved all sorts of flattery, but also he loved taking the mick out of people.
You say at one point in the book that more than was true for anybody else, for FDR, the presidency was him. He was utterly comfortable in that situation, wasn't he?
Yeah, and I can't think of any other president really you could describe that. Sorry, that was rather clumsy English, but yes, he wore the presidency like a comfortable old sweater, if you like, and he used the White House genuinely as a private house. It was full of his children. Eleanor worked out of the White House.
And Harry Hopkins moved in one day and didn't move out.
Exactly. He was unwell, Harry Hopkins. He came in and just stayed. And there are all sorts of people lingering around. During the war, as the war went on, all sorts of visiting royalty were put up in the White House too. I mean, just treated it just like his country house in Hyde Park in New York, which of course was a big, not so big actually when you get there, but it's a rambling house for an old school toff's house, if you like.
We'll come to the Isolationists shortly and do a couple of them, but one of the worries that the Isolationists had, and that quite a lot of other people had, was that Roosevelt was drawing more and more power to himself and was becoming a dictator. And of course, they knew all about dictators because they could see them across in Europe. I mean, from a purely constitutional point of view, they had a point, didn't they?
They did have a point, but the Constitution, of course, is pretty vague. It is designed not to work very well. The executive is separate from the legislature, which is Congress, which is separate from the Supreme Court. And those three wings of office fight each other. It's quite the opposite of the parliamentary system. You have to have a majority or cobble together a majority of the legislature in order to become the chief executive. But the chief executive in the United States is separate. And the powers were never quite delineated. And in the 18th century, of course, a lot of powers you couldn't expect to be delineated because they hadn't arisen yet, various things that could be done. And yes, they were worried about it. They're worried about that today, I mean, it remains a great fissure between the left and right in the United States about whether there should be a government at all. And to have a president who took more and more powers to himself.
And FDR wasn't averse to drawing more power to himself.
Absolutely not. After all, he became the president in 1932, and the first 2 terms he spent licking the New Deal. I mean, and that, to the extent that in his second term, the Supreme Court actually did rule to say that he was out of order, that he'd taken all sorts of powers he should never have had.
It.
Exactly. So, which didn't stop him at all, thank goodness. for getting involved in World War II, which there was an enormous reluctance in the United States to have anything to do with another European conflict. After World War I, they only lost something like a quarter, I say only, 250,000 compared to the many, many millions that the French and the Germans and the Brits and the Russians lost in World War I. But even that 250,000 was too many for most Americans.
I was going to ask if America ever really did mobilize for war in the same way that some Europeans did. Somebody once said that the Germans didn't. They had this Hausfrau idea, so they never put the women to work in the factories the way we did in Britain. What about America? Did she mobilize as fundamentally as the European nations?
Oh, absolutely. In the end, again, this is all to do with the executive action. Franklin Roosevelt did deals with private industry. So, for instance, General Motors went wholesale over to producing tanks. It stopped making cars altogether. Even Ford, who actually was an isolationist.
A big isolationist, and as you point out, a big anti-Semite.
Anti-Semite. Used to run a free newspaper, an anti-Semitic newspaper. He used to distribute through his Ford dealerships. A big stack of them in the corner of the showroom.
Now, he wasn't in day-to-day control of his company anymore, but he still had the influence to make his son, the ridiculously named Edsel,
yes,
do what he wanted. But in the end, of course, money, business, commerce overruled principle.
Ford, who was a great anti-communist, had great factories in the Soviet Union too, so he always put business first. That's one of the things about a number of particularly American quasi-political public figures. And that is that all those rich men who run America today, the Koch brothers and so on, who sign checks in order to have their opinions, when it comes to it, actually, they're interested only in the business. Rupert Murdoch, for instance, people think of him as a great conservative tyrant, which he is, but on the other hand, he also will get into bed with Tony Blair or anybody else. He's just interested in getting his business ahead, and that's what so many, it turned out in this pivotal, in terms of the history of the world, a pivotal battle between totalitarianism and democracy. It came down to a number of businessmen putting business ahead of their own sneaky totalitarian thoughts, I think.
There was opposition, of course. There was isolationism. We're going to talk about, in particular, the two most colourful figures that you follow in the book, although there are lots, and you tell us about all the movements, which, by the way, I really love. I love the intrigue and the diplomacy that goes on. But let's start off with Lindbergh, Charles Lindbergh, the most famous aviator in the world, because he was the first man to single-handedly cross the Atlantic. He was a damn nuisance, wasn't he?
He was a pest, yeah, to put it mildly. He was a sort of Kim Kardashian. He actually hadn't done very much. He'd sat in a plane, actually. He was a very good engineer. But apart from that, he hadn't achieved very much. But this was the beginning of worldwide celebrity. It was the beginning of the radio. It was the beginning of mass media in general. And so on both sides of the Atlantic, he was considered a really big deal. And so people took notice of his views as if they mattered.
Although he wasn't, I mean, how bright was he? He was wrong about almost everything. He was also anti-Semitic, yeah, of course, and he was taken in by the Nazis. He didn't look behind them at what they were doing, but he was wrong. I mean, in 1940, you report him as standing up saying, whether America enters this war is completely up to us. It really wasn't, and the Japanese showed that at Pearl Harbor. And Dorothy Thompson, you quote as from the New York Post as calling him a somber cretin. I think it was the phrase she used, which is lovely. Was he just not very bright?
I think he was simple, which might be different. I think that he was capable of, I wouldn't say lucid thought, but he was capable of argument.
Sort of more P.G. Wodehouse than Lord Haw-Haw.
Exactly. I don't think he was a wicked person, or at least didn't set out to be a wicked person. His father was also anti-Semitic and a big isolationist, so he sort of inherited lock, stock and barrel his views from his father. It was a bit like Rand Paul and Ron Paul, actually. They're quite similar in that sense. And not only was he armed with this sort of gullibility, if you like, he was a sort of innocent abroad. He was sort of Pinocchio character, and he was not critical when he should be, that he wasn't using his brain when he should be using his brain. Because he was the world's most famous flyer, he was taken around by Goering, or Goering's pals. They certainly partied by Goering, and shown the new burgeoning and totally illegal under international law air force that Germany was building before the war. And he reported back. He thought he was doing the right thing by reporting back to the American embassy. He actually took American embassy people with him. But actually he was being duped. The fact was that the Germans were flying planes from airport to airport to airport. And so...
to persuade him that they had lots.
They had lots.
Because he got his figures wrong all the time.
All the time. And so when he went to Cliveden, for instance, the great appeaser's nest, half an hour out of London...
The Nancy Astor set, yeah.
Exactly. Which is where he would meet Geoffrey Dawson, the appeasing editor of the Times, and all sorts of people in the government. He would frighten them to death by saying, my goodness, I've just had a tour of the German airfields and they've got thousands of planes. And he said in public too, there's absolutely no chance that Britain could survive an onslaught of the Luftwaffe as it's currently consisted. So, yeah, he himself was duped and it went wrong. But it didn't stop him, of course. I mean, that's the other thing.
Shut up.
Exactly. Mostly people in a hole, when they get something wrong, they would shut up. But he kept on and on and on. Each of these isolationists, one of the wonderful things about this story is that Franklin Roosevelt just waited his time, like an angler or something, or in this case, a sniper. He waited for them to wander through the crosshairs and would zap them. It took a little time to entrap Lindbergh, actually. He did it by putting him in uniform and then telling him, excuse me, but you're part of the United States Air Force now, so you can shut up. And that's the end of it. But he wriggled out of that too, and they kept trying to put him in and out. And he ended up, strangely, of course, in the South Pacific, where he actually flew combat missions against the Japanese.
And it had a distinguished war in there.
Exactly, strangely. Yeah, I mean, it was kept secret, and as soon as anyone found out, he was immediately shipped stateside. And by the way, he was only doing it for fun. I mean, I don't think that, well, maybe he had some bizarre racial theories. And it might be that the Japanese were the sort of people he thought he was entitled to kill. But I mean, he had that sort of notion about people. And so maybe it wasn't so bad to shoot Japanese for him. But for him, it was a lark. What he liked to do, really, he was a test pilot above all. Which is a particular mentality, I think, when you actually get into a very strange machine and then take it miles up into the air to see whether it works. I mean, I think that it's not for everyone.
It's a certain kind of man.
And so I think that maybe a lack of imagination, maybe. Anyway.
Well, you tell us that Senator Bora approached him in 1939 to stand for president in 1940. At least he had the wit to know that he wasn't up to that. But, I mean, what I really want to ask is, how dangerous was Lindbergh?
Oh, if he'd been on his own, not dangerous enough, easily dismissed. But there were too many people just like him, I think. So that there were a bunch of maybe 10 prominent isolationists in all who really, as today in America, single very rich men can push public opinion around pretty easily if they want to. And so I think Lindbergh on his own wasn't too much of a danger, and my goodness, thank goodness he didn't have any charisma or any organising powers. The isolationists...
And wouldn't join as well. America First, the organisation...
Wouldn't even join America First, exactly.
Wanted him to be their chairman.
Yes. But he was very much a loner. I mean, flying alone, I don't know how many hours it took him, something like 14 hours or something across the Atlantic.
You do know, because it's in your book. 33.
Thank you, 33. 33 hours
I had
across.
to look him up as well. He didn't die till 1974. Of course, he was young. He was 25 when
exactly,
he
was a kid.
The
boy-faced.
So he died at 72 in 1974. He lived to see all of the aftermath.
Absolutely. And there was no mea culpa. There was no...
No, because he did his autobiography, didn't he?
Yeah, endlessly. He would justify himself as opposed to saying, I got some of these things wrong. And his wife didn't help too, Anne Murrow, who was actually a very nice but also gullible woman. And
she wasn't as stupid as him, though.
No,
do you think she was?
No.
She was not nice. She was
naive. They were, a lot of people get caught in great events. But the astonishing thing for Lindbergh, of course, is that he was so young and he was quite prepared to defy the President of the United States. I mean, that takes a lot of gall.
Speaking of rich men, we move on to Joseph Kennedy, the father as everybody will know, of President Jack Kennedy. But you rather sweetly, you never say who these people are when they come in, and so you never refer to the future of the peripheral characters. Joseph Kennedy, you tell us all about, and he was an amazing individual as well. He ended up being sent by Roosevelt to England to be the ambassador to Britain. How? I mean, that's the weirdest appointment you can think of. It just blows your mind.
Yes, Joe Kennedy was the most prominent Democratic isolationist. And one of the tricks of the Sphinx was not to say whether he was declaring or not. And Mrs. Clinton, Hillary Clinton, right now is doing exactly the same trick. She is saying, I've got nothing to say about the presidency. I'll let you know later if I'm running, if I am. And I'm not even telling you whether I'm even thinking about running, and so on. And as long as that happens, it means that no one else can raise a cent. The United States runs on monetary politics.
I've heard that.
Yes. So the bigger the checkbook, the more likely you are to win.
And of course, Kennedy had the money to run without raising any. He was fantastic. These people were unbelievably
that was
rich.
that was the danger. So Franklin Roosevelt could choke off all the other Democrats because until he declared, they couldn't raise a cent. But Joe Kennedy, of course, was well armed with money. He made a fortune on the stock market. He made another fortune in Hollywood. He had enough money that not only he and his wife Rose, but all of his many children had trust funds, which meant they would never have to work a day in their lives. And this money, he thought quite rightly, I only have one life. I could do with being president. A Catholic he was, which was unusual. There'd never been a Catholic president, and wasn't to be a Catholic president until his son Jack. But he thought that if ever a Catholic could become the president, it would be in the unusual circumstances in which he could stand saying, I am determined to keep the United States out of the war that's going on across the Atlantic. And he never really got his chance because I live in the United States now and I watch all these people. They need to collect a whole number of things before they can really set off. One, the most important, is foreign policy experience, however trivial, a trip to Venice will do it almost. And in this case, Joe Kennedy persuaded Franklin Roosevelt that if he could go to London as the ambassador, that would be jolly useful. And after all, it was a critical time. The war was...
But Roosevelt fell upon this as a starving man upon food, didn't he? Because it got Kennedy out of America.
Exactly. Well, first of all, of course, he said no. And then he slept on it. And then he thought, what a great idea, because it was rather like putting Lindbergh in uniform. He's now a government employee. I can send him over to the other side of the Atlantic, and I can keep him swinging in the wind. And he just refused to allow him to come back and resign.
As much as Kennedy wanted to.
As much as he came back, by the way. He would actually come back. I mean, Kennedy would sulk. He would go to his compound in Florida, and he would hang out there with a lot of old grumbling people.
Kennedy had something to sulk about. His position as ambassador was a purely political dodge, wasn't it?
Yes.
Roosevelt was using other channels to get his information. He was keeping things from Kennedy. He was not treating him properly. Roosevelt was not playing the game at all with Kennedy.
Not at all. No. Roosevelt intended from the very first place, and it was part of their relationship. And it had always been that he was always making fun of him and always humiliating him. That is, Roosevelt was always humiliating Kennedy. Kennedy, of course, was a poor Catholic from Boston, which is you don't want to be. You want to be a WASP if you live in Boston. And he'd done very well. He'd married the mayor's daughter, and he thought he'd done pretty well. But he really couldn't be, just in terms of, don't believe Americans who say there's no class in America. There is. And so little Joe Kennedy, the Catholic boy, little Irish boy, could not really trounce the impeccable credentials and wealth of Franklin Roosevelt, who was a natural Dutch-born patrician who'd always come from money in New York. By the way, Franklin Roosevelt had enough money, trust fund, $1.4 million in today's money per year without doing anything at all. And that's leaving aside the fact that his mother was also rich as Croesus and would buy houses for him and so on. I mean, he was comfortably well off. Today, it's the same. American democracy is largely about very rich men battling it out between each other about who can play the game more efficiently.
Well, class, of course, means that Kennedy gets inserted into London society, and he becomes a part of the Cliveden set as well, and loves it. And he feels accepted until his defeatism puts him in bad odour, and then he thinks, they've gone all anti-American on me, whereas they'd just gone anti-Joe, hadn't they?
They'd gone anti-Joe because Joe Kennedy could never resist telling the Brits what they didn't want to hear, and that is, you're going to lose the war. Of course, he turned out to be completely wrong about that, not least because the Americans finally came in. But he was blunt about it, and he would say it at the grandest occasions. You go to white tie dinners where he would give a speech and make everybody miserable by saying, you may as well enjoy this last couple of years because you're not going to be here. And he was blunt about it. But you're quite right that he was seduced, and maybe that's part of being, a poor boy made good. He was not only fell in with the Astors, for goodness sake. If you're an American, the Astors are rather more important than royalty. But he also fell in with royalty. He came to the conclusion, he was gullible too, maybe. He actually thought that when King George VI and Queen Elizabeth befriended him, that they were actually genuinely befriending them. I think he misunderstood the Constitution. Their function in life is to do what the state needs them to do. And if you're told, be nice to the American ambassador because we need America to come into the war, then they do that. And they did that. But he felt somehow that he was close to the king. But the strange thing was that in the brief visit that King George VI and Queen Elizabeth made to Hyde Park and stayed with Roosevelt, actually Roosevelt and the king did in a very short time strike up a rapport.
But Roosevelt had a genius for that, didn't he? You also get into the relationship between Roosevelt and Churchill. And Roosevelt was just brilliantly good at handling people.
He was, yeah. Which was, I must say, it's one of the great delights of writing a book about somebody like Franklin Roosevelt. And the previous one was about John Maynard Keynes, who was always a delight, my last book. But every day I could at least think, well, I'm going to spend some happy chuckling hours with Franklin Roosevelt because he was very droll, very dry sense of humor, and just a very nice person. I mean, when he was having a martini, I would sort of pour myself a martini. He was a very sort of biddable, enjoyable fellow. And he was Sphinx-like. I mean, he never quite, I don't think his wife ever understood him particularly, nor her, by the way. But I think he was a mystery to most people. He was a bit of a loner. But my goodness, it came in very straight. He liked to be liked. But it puzzled people. They would go in with a complaint and they would leave convinced about a totally different issue. And the complaint was never addressed. And he was also a master politician. He obviously just enjoyed manipulating the game, which is interesting because there are not many of them who can do it. President Obama, for instance, can't do it. He really cannot play that game. He can't go for a game of golf. He can't have a drink with somebody.
Which Bill Clinton had the feel for it. He was the best of his generation at that. Where are we now? I mean, in terms of isolationism, is it fair to describe President Obama as an isolationist minded? He's not wanted to get into wars. He's not wanted to go and confront. And one feels that an era has ended in American politics, and that it's respectable to be isolationist again.
Yeah. If you think what's happened though since 2001, since 9/11, the West has, but particularly America, they've paid for it all, both in people and money, 2 long wars. In Iraq, 10 years, Afghanistan, 14 years. 2
ill-advised long wars.
Yeah, at least one of them was unnecessary. You could argue the toss about Afghanistan. Somebody should have read a little more history in the Defense Department, I think. The State Department told them not to do it, but the Defense Department, this is Donald Rumsfeld's war.
We could have told them. The Russians could have told them.
Exactly. There are lists of empires that have collapsed on Afghanistan. And I think that an American voter today could quite honestly think, so we spend all this treasure, we've spent all of these lives, we've got lots of boys with one leg or one eye or one arm or whatever, and where exactly has it got us, this intervention? And I think that in the way that prime ministers and presidents tend to always respond to the person who's just left the office, I think following on from George W. Bush and his buccaneer, his adventurous approach to foreign policy, it was time, quite rightly, he was elected, by the way, in order to dampen this stuff down. We don't, let's not get involved in every last, 2-bit squabble that happens in the Middle East.
Thank goodness he didn't go into Crimea.
Yeah, absolutely. Anyway, I think that his is something different from isolationism, though. I think that whereas you might call him a minimalist, that is, we're going to do the least we can possibly do, and we're also going to pretend that other people are doing it if possible. Let's get the French or the Brits to head up these things like Libya. But an isolationist, and there are some of them around, and they're growing. There are people like Rand Paul, who says, you can tell an isolationist today in the United States because they start off saying, first let me make clear I am not an isolationist. And then they will list you all the
like
things
some
that
of my
you can...
best friends are Jews.
Exactly, absolutely, or gay, what exactly. So what they couch it in other terms. They say, we shouldn't spend so much money on foreign aid. You know, there are enough things that we need to be done here. We should bring as many boys home as possible because we need the money. That is what might be called sort of fiscal isolationism. That is to say, we need to get the debt down, so why don't we stop spending money abroad with boys in uniform or on helicopters and all this other expensive toys for boys that the military uses. Of course, what they then don't explain is if you bring all the boys home, all you do is fire them. That's the only way you can ever save any money. If you're going to bring them home to America, then they carry on spending, you carry on employing them. So there's certainly on the back of George W. Bush a great chunk of the Tea Party who are they're irritated about Wall Street and everything that happened to that, and they're irritated about everything that they believe that the war machine, the commercial war arm of the United States economy, it has Congress in its pocket. And so they're not very happy about that. And it'll be very interesting to see how far Rand Paul will push that. The general wisdom is that isolationism, still to this day, is one of the great triumphs of Franklin Roosevelt. You can't be an isolationist today and be taken seriously. It'd be interesting to see whether he shows his ankle as a little bit of an isolationist, at least during his presidential rumble.
Well, the book is The Sphinx by Nicholas Wapshott. It's published by Norton at £18.99. Nicholas, thank you very much.
Great pleasure, Tim. Thanks very much again.
That was The Books Podcast with Tim Haig. The Books Podcast is produced by Green Shoot. You can find out more at www.green-shoot.com, and Tim can be contacted on tim@green-shoot.com.